The Diablo 4 beta lets players traverse a small portion of the mapped world using one of 3 available characters: Rogue, Sorceress, or Barbarian. The Necromancer and Druid are unavailable in this build. Completing the main questline as far as this beta will allow, approximately the first act, carries a character to level 20 to 24 and takes a handful of hours. I had some trouble logging in for a while immediately after beta launch, but have otherwise had no server issues and the game runs fine on my old RTX 2060. Overall, there are some good things and some sad realizations about Diablo 4. First off, Diablo 4 has reached a pleasing compromise in between the very gate-kept and binding skill trees of Diablo 2, which nostalgia dictates that I have to love, and the more casual, loose-feeling skill system of Diablo 3, where the skill choices feel immaterial, picked and chosen on a whim. There is a small gold coin cost, scaled by level, associated with re-specifying skill points in Diablo 4, which is very approachable, certainly letting young characters experiment cheaply. Skill trees are organized by function rather than theme, so for Sorceress, instead of grouping by fire, ice, and lightning, skills are arranged by basic attacks, core attacks, defensive abilities, summoning, and support spells, with the latter trees becoming accessible once a certain number of skill points are utilized in the skill nodes before. The game, therefore, has accelerated the speed at which characters gain access to their principal offensive skills in the core skill tree. So a level 4 Rogue can Strafe, a level 4 Barbarian can Whirlwind, and a level 4 Sorceress can use Frozen Orb. Some of the passive skills feel weak, but I like the skill trees in general. Definite improvement over Diablo 3. The visceral satisfaction gained from using most of the skills is also improved. There is Bethesda's usual excellent sound and art direction during moment-to-moment combat. The graphics generally lean into the darker aesthetic of Diablo 1 and 2, which is my preference, rather than the somewhat brighter and cartoonier Diablo 3, and it includes some nice set pieces. Thumbs up here. It's also nice that instead of weapon switching, characters can keep equipped all the different kinds of weapon they need to use when activating the relevant skill. So a rogue can carry bows and daggers at the same time, and the weapon in hand automatically switches depending on the skill used. Functional. Good. I'm biased towards the Sorceress because I do not like the need for Barbarian and Rogue classes to attack in order to generate energy to use other advanced skills. I much prefer the recharging mana system, and Chain Lightning is fun, especially with a single opponent. However, I was often bored while playing. Diablo 4's loot tables, for the most part, feel lifeless, as if generated by an algorithm. Added to that, the open world acts as a connected series of corridors, arenas, and dungeons that level scale with your character. To clarify, that means every zone you visit is automatically morphed to match your character level, and loot level matches too. The Elder Scrolls Oblivion tried this. It is not a smart foundation on which to build any open world, because it punishes progress, kneecaps player agency, and denigrates the world as a character in itself by forcing it to conform to the player. It is a codependent way for a world to operate, and frankly, lazy design. Now you might be thinking, dude, that's how all Diablo games work. Enemies scale with the player to keep it challenging. Diablo 2 basically level matched their zones, but they just predicted what level you'd be at in certain areas instead of auto-scaling it. Same difference, bro. What would be the point of going to a level 1 zone as a level 10 character? Lol. Perhaps the difference is subtle, but it is important. In Diablo 2, you could choose what level of enemies you were engaging, and appreciate the peaks and troughs in difficulty that arise due to the interplay between relative monster and player power. If you were impatient, you could press ahead, and their challenge would eventually force you to stop. If the enemies were too easy, experience gain would become negligible, and you'd have to progress through zones to be rewarded, unless you were hunting for specific items. The level area prediction that Diablo 2 developers engaged in was called game design. The system was designed to create zones that were too much of a challenge to conquer, and zones that the player had effectively made safe by outgrowing, perhaps once hard but now a stroll in the park. Neither of these types of areas are allowed to exist in Diablo 4. The loot drops and the game world have been balanced to such an extent that they are almost totally flatlined. There are smart ways to keep zones relevant and replayable. Think about how Elden Ring did this, a stunning game. Irrespective of loot rewards, the mere look and feel of it made you want to explore. But like many older games, it scattered tough enemies throughout early zones that players would get thrashed by, and later revisit, then conquer and feel uplifted, and eventually thrash them on the regular in revenge. Maybe Diablo 4 could open small areas of each zone as time passes to reflect Lilith's changing influence in the world. Maybe keep the low-level creeps entirely the same, but layer on more, some new arrivals, some unique enemies, rather than wiping the slate clean and replacing it to match your level. Maybe crafting could have more of a point and harvesting ingredients and collectibles made more interesting. But it is okay if gameplay zones become redundant, become safe, become mere circulation corridors between harder areas. Making the world feel safe is usually part of the illusion of progress that a game of this kind should want to cultivate. And Diablo 4 does do this a bit by allowing players to liberate overrun settlements, and then they spring back to peaceful life. The key is the psychological effect that player choice has on the player, as well as its effect on the world as a character in its own right. Players stop engaging with the world by way of seeking out different challenges because it's all the same. At level X, the entire world is level X. So exploration is stripped of a core component of intrigue. Because Sanctuary is constantly morphing to suit the player, it has less impact, less substance as a narrative or gameplay tool. It's just a mirror for the player rather than a full expression of itself. Now, this world system is probably intended to give developers levers of control to execute world events and the like. This could either be really compelling, or lean into MMO-timed events and microtransactional nonsense. Who knows? This level scaling ensures that every player is going to get a near constant drip of slightly, minutely better items that feel very similar. Like the parable of the boiling frog, players sit in a sea of gradually rising numbers, never really noticing the minutiae of change that's occurring to them. Loot drops are dull as a result, and shop offerings fairly pointless. There are some saving graces, fortunately. Magical effects called aspects from legendary items, those tiered between rare and unique, can be extracted and added to other items, so that this magical effect is preserved for future use, and some of them are quite useful. This is a really nice addition, though something of a sticking plaster solution over the generally mundane loot. If the very hard to find unique items are not scaled and incredibly powerful, that would go a long way to saving how treasure hunting feels, to raising the stakes of it. But I suspect that unique items will only be moderately better than legendary ones, fingers crossed nonetheless. Crafting for a few added percent efficiency to your current items feels a bit worthless. There is very little incentive to invest in your items, and in a couple of levels you are near guaranteed to swap them out, especially because loot drops are also heavily biased towards being for your character class, which is fine in itself, but does compound the problem of scaled and samey loot. I played through the beta without buying anything from shops or putting any gems in sockets, those are back by the way, because no weapon felt like I was going to keep it for any substantial length of time, which by the end of my playthrough was absolutely true. Maybe I'm getting a little fluffy, let's draw some graphs. Player power versus enemy power against player character level. This is obviously not scientific, but just illustrative. For Diablo 4 and 3, player damage shows a gradual, stable increase, and enemy hit points grow a bit faster than that. These lines are what some players mean when they say gameplay is balanced, and what other players mean when they say gameplay is flat. This relationship is serviced by scaling loot drops, so let's draw best loot drops over worst loot drops versus level. So the difference between the worst item that can drop and the best is quite low in Diablo 4. For Diablo 2, the range of difference between the worst item that can drop and the best is almost always vast. So while the trend is that the player damage grows, there is a variance to the rate of growth. A barbarian equips his first pike, a sorceress can finally cast Frozen Orb, a rune word is crafted, a set completed. One of the numerous keeper items in Diablo 2 is found. Finding these items feels amazing, and it is these moments that entice players to keep hunting, and the knock-on effect of these moments makes the gameplay experience feel more alive because it varies the interplay between player and enemy power levels. The player, having found an item that represents a big step up in power, can then choose to press into the harder areas of the game, thus determining enemy power for themselves. And if they haven't found anything good, they can keep grinding magic find runs. Some will call that unbalanced, but the degree to which Diablo 2 is unbalanced is intentional, and near perfectly designed for the purposes of encouraging exploration and driving loot hunting. Perfect balance must not be flat, because the life is in the bumps. The life is in the bumps. Diablo 2 also does a slightly better job varying its moment-to-moment difficulty, sometimes swarming the player into retreating and regrouping, sometimes giving you a bit of respite, while Diablo 4 feels like it spawns a fairly steady stream of enemies that will neither leave you alone nor overwhelm you. But the skeleton of Diablo 4 is very sound, and has obviously taken a lot of work. I like the graphics, I like the small measure of moral greys that could be read into the story of Lilith and Inarius. I like the feel of its gameplay, but the foundation of its reward system demonstrates a dim understanding of how these incentive structures work, which is really, really weird, to the extent that I feel like I must be wrong. Do most people grind up their meals into paste, sacrificing any sense of variety for balance? Is the spice of life actually dependable humdrum? I mean, I understand the temptation of developers to boil a game down to its surface essentials. What do players want? Loot that raises numbers. Raising numbers is fun. Doing it more often is more fun. And players want experience points. So make every zone efficient at generating experience by auto-matching their enemy levels to the player. What a shortcut. So smart. Who cares about variation, exploration, or player agency? It is enjoyable for players to be allowed to feel like they have worked out their own means of efficiency, and less fun to have it spoon-fed to them.
Felix doesn't want to be fed, he wants to hunt.
And the fun of rising numbers on loot needs to be evaluated alongside the desire for players to become attached to their items. Back 20 years ago, when I first played Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, I named my first half-decent sword. It was just magic, a cruel Highland blade, but I ended up using it for a long time, and I fell in love with that sword. And I knew it wasn't particularly worth anything in trade, so I named it Brundig's Cruel Highland Blade. Its max damage was 377. I loved it so much I ventured into the game world and fetched it out. Now we're married. I will never remember any such detail about any item in Diablo 3 or 4. Blizzard is so desperate to pepper us with new items that give nominally higher numbers that you never keep anything for more than a few hours. I suppose in Diablo 4 you can get attached to the appearance of your items, using the customization wardrobe. So, Diablo 4 is somewhat disappointing in its effort to scratch that classic Diablo itch, which is one of treasure hunting, unraveling efficiency, puzzles, and cathartic combat gameplay. It only succeeds in that last bit, and while the discovery of efficient ways to populate the skill tree is fun, finding efficient ways to level up doesn't appear to be required because the whole world is the same, and also always online, and also at risk of becoming very MMO-like. Hopefully loot tables will change. Hopefully the MMO nightmare won't come true. Hopefully this is just a beta thing. Maybe all will be well. I'll still play through the various classes, come the full release in the summer, and I'll post an updated verdict if it proves to be more promising, but I'm not holding my breath. And if you don't care about loot, maybe just play Vampire Survivors instead of giving £60 to ActivisionBlizzard. Is there a reason I'm missing? Could someone please explain to me why Diablo 2's loot table is so difficult for its sequels to emulate? Is this not obvious for most people? Maybe my brain is just too wrinkled. A bumpy, knotted mass of think flesh. Not an iota of smoothness in sight. The life is in the bumps.